Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Okeefe Gleeson, and I'm with the HSE National Office for Human Rights and Equality Policy in the National Quality Improvement Division. I'm delighted to welcome you to our third session in our webinar series on supporting the consent process for the vaccination programme against Sars-CoV-2, COVID-19. And today's session will be specifically on the acute hospitals. There have been two other webinars in this series, the details of which will be posted in the chat box during today's webinar. Today's session will specifically focus on how to support a person to consent for the COVID-19 vaccination in an acute hospital. The vaccination programme is now well underway in residential settings, in the community and among staff. Today's focus is on the practical support and information required on how to ensure valid and informed consent is obtained before the vaccination is administered in a busy acute hospital. Guidance will also be shared on how to elicit a person's will and preference to vaccination if their capacity is in question. We have an excellent panel of experts who will address a myriad of questions associated with consent and vaccination. Our webinar will be is chaired today by Professor Mary Donnelly, who is Professor at the School of Law and UCC and is co-chair of the HSE National Consent Policy. As always, we have a diverse audience, so welcome to all of you from every corner of Ireland and to those joining from outside of the HSE and from other jurisdictions. We are aware that many people are on leave this week, so we would ask you to bring the webinar to the attention of those, particularly in acute settings. It'll be available online towards the end of this week. The webinar has been organised by our office and the National Quality Improvement Team. Our office has oversight of the National Consent Policy, which includes the Do Not Attempt Resuscitation Policy. We are also leading on the preparation of the HSE for the commencement of the Assisted Decision Making Capacity Act. We have a responsibility for a number of other human rights and equality issues as well. In terms of some of the practical requirements for today, the chat box is open. We will try and help with your technical issues through this function. And we have a team of people that are providing support to us today. Jacqueline, Marie, Maeve, Ross and Orla are helping us today. Please post your technical questions in the chat box to all panelists, not the host, to make sure that we'll be able to address them. If you address them only to the host, then we won't be able to get to them on time. You don't have to worry about muting yourself. It happens, you're muted automatically. If you wish to change your view, you can go to the top right-hand corner of the video screen and it will give you a number of options. We would advise that you use the grid view so you're able to see everybody, all the panelists during the panel discussion. If you're having issues with sound or internet connectivity, you can dial into the webinar. The details are in the chat box now. Sometimes the sound can be clearer if you dial rather than through the internet. Orla will share various links for information on the vaccination programme, the process for vaccination and other supporting documentation in relation to COVID-19 throughout the webinar. Keep an eye on the chat box for this information during the session. The webinar is being recorded and, as I said, it'll be made available towards the end of the week. We've been awarded CPD points from the RCPI, 1 point, and then CU points from the Nursing and Midwifery Board, 2 from them. Next week, you will receive an email with your certificate of attendance and on how to apply for your CPD points. Those of you with CORU, the Law Society, Bar Council of Ireland or the Dental Council, you can use your certificate as proof of attendance, but please note that CPD and NMBI points are only awarded to those attending the live event, which is a stipulation by those accrediting bodies. The webinar will finish at 4:15 today. So I'd now like to hand you over to Professor Mary Donnelly, who will chair today's session. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Okeefe. It's a great delight to be here with you. And our goal today is to make this as practically relevant to everybody as possible. And we're particularly concerned with the experience of people who are trying to support the vaccination process in acute hospitals. We have a very accomplished panel of speakers, but before we turn to those, I'd like to turn first to Dr. Philip Cooley, who's the National Director for Quality Improvement in the HSE and has been a remarkable support to the consent policy, to the role of the Human Rights Unit, and to this webinar series, which has dealt with issues of vaccination. So thank you very much, Dr. Cooley, for joining us.
Thank you, Mary. And look at another important day, I think, on this journey of both the vaccination and the inputs of the human rights team under the quality improvement team's guidance to really try and steer us, I think, in a clear way in relation to how we administer the vaccination program and ensure that adequate consent is observed and carried out. It's the third webinar in this series, and they've all been extremely well attended. So thank you all very much for attending, because really the attendees are what make this process, because we'll draw off your inputs in the chat box throughout the session, and that will help inform our work into the future. We're into the third month of the vaccination program. It's all played out very much in the public domain, so you'll be very aware, I think, of where we're at. I think overall, the Irish Health Service has been doing extremely well in administering all available vaccine to the priority groups. First of all, in residential care, then obviously the healthcare workers, and now the over 85s. So obviously we've had some issues in relation to vaccine supply, and just some recent issues in relation to potential safety concerns that may or may not play out as being significant. So this is something that we've had to deal with and adapt the program to as we go. So in this kind of context, and in any context, consent is a very, very important process. And the National Consent Policy is the responsibility of my team in the HSE, and we're updating it at the moment. Today we hope to clarify really how the principles of consent apply where you work. We have a very excellent panel of presenters, I have to say, and as I say, an expert audience. Shivani Rea, Professor Sean Okeefe, Joanne Conlon, Chantel Migoney, Mary O'Sullivan, and Sarah Lennon will be on hand to steer us through the event. But do you please use the chat function, because your inputs, your frontline expertise, your findings, your thoughts will inform how we continue to advise the rest of the system on these important subjects. So now, really, without delaying things too much, I'd like to hand you over to the very capable hands of Professor Mary Donnelly, who I have to say has been an extraordinary stalwart in our efforts in this space and in a number of spaces. She's been an amazing supporter to the quality improvement team and the human rights team within it. She co-chairs our consent advisory group. She chairs our ADM steering group, and I can only thank you, Mary, for everything that you do in this really important area and for chairing today. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much, Philip. Apologies, I'm having a slight camera difficulty. Hopefully it will sort itself out shortly. So I'm very delighted to introduce Dr. Shivani Rea, who is the National Clinical Lead for Integrated Care, and in her spare time is an old age psychiatrist in University Hospital in Tala. So thank you very much, Siobhan. Siobhan's going to talk about the background. Yes. Thank you, Shivani.
Thanks a million. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about the background of consent and vaccination. And I just want to thank Philip and Mary for introducing and facilitating this webinar, and indeed Okeefe and Mary Tighe, who've done an awful lot of work to organise it. So I'm not going to dwell on too many issues. I'm just going to skirt over some of the issues of consent, particularly as it relates to vaccination for COVID-19 against COVID-19. And my colleague, Professor Sean Okeefe, will then give a more detailed presentation. So if there are any difficulties with seeing the presentation, please let me know in the chat box. So in this, so I'm just going to talk a little bit about the principles of consent. So we know that consent is the giving of permission or agreement for an intervention such as vaccination. It involves a process of communication about the proposed intervention, and the need for consent is recognised in Irish and international law. The general presumption, however, is that people do have capacity to consent. Informed consent is ensuring that a person has received sufficient information in a way that's comprehensible to them about the nature, potential risks and benefits of the proposed intervention, of any alternative intervention, and of not receiving the intervention. It's important that for consent to be properly informed, that somebody is not acting under duress and has the decision-making capacity to make that decision, even if that does require support to do so. So specifically with relation to COVID-19 vaccination and informed consent. Consent is always specific to the proposed intervention, in this case, the specific vaccine that's being administered. All material risks and benefits of the vaccine must be disclosed. Information should include individual as well as societal benefits that may be conferred by herd immunity. And in the early days of vaccination, when we knew we were heading into this vaccination programme, the Attorney General was very clear that they wanted us to emphasise not just individual but societal benefits in terms of the vaccination. It's important as well that information is disclosed to somebody in a way that's comprehensible and understandable to them. So there will be people whose capacity to consent will be impaired. So what do you do then? Well, consider extra supports. So for example, consulting a person who's close to that individual. The person must be given information in a manner and language that they understand in relation to the vaccination. And we do have various vaccination information leaflets that have been formed and made with specific populations in mind. The benefit to the person needs to be considered. How likely is it to benefit somebody? And the will and preferences of somebody need to be considered. Is there any information about the person's views on previous vaccinations? So I think if somebody's got the flu vaccine every year, you can take it that it's likely to be their will and preference that they're happy to have this vaccination. So what are the 4 steps then in determining capacity? Well, the things you need to know is, does the individual understand the information relevant to the decision, including the risks of refusing vaccination? And this is particularly important, and again goes back to the Attorney General's advice. The risk of refusing isn't just the risk to themselves, but also the risk to the wider population. Is an individual capable of retaining the information long enough to make a decision? And that doesn't have to be for long at all. So in my own clinical career, I do an awful lot of capacity assessments. And if somebody can retain the information long enough to use it, weigh it up, and inform me of their decision making, that is sufficient. And sometimes that can be as short as 5 or 6 minutes. Can the individual then communicate their decision? Now remember, communication can be verbal. It doesn't have to be verbal. It can involve using sign language or other means of communication. And in fact, once, a good while ago, I was discussing a very particular complex capacity assessment with the patient about whether or not they were able to go home. And his way of signalling that he understood to me what it was all about was to stand up in the chair and give me a big hug and a big smile. But at least we both knew what we were talking about by the end of that assessment. Sorry, now I'm just going to move on here. So specific considerations in vaccination. It's important to know that no other person, such as a family member or next of kin, can consent or refuse consent to vaccination on behalf of an adult person. And this is a very common misconception, particularly in the acute hospital setting. If someone isn't able to vaccinate or someone isn't able to give consent, that you ask a family member to sign a consent form. That is not valid consent. It's only valid if you have legal authority to do so. So within our Irish consent policy, decisions should be made in the best interest of the person, bearing in mind the principles we talked about before. And particularly in relation to the COVID-19 vaccination, the Registrar of the Wards of Court has confirmed that there's no requirement to seek a court order or court consent for the administration of vaccine to wards of court. And we'll talk a little bit more about wards of court as we go on, because there has been one case that's gone to the High Court on this. Specifically for individuals detained under the Mental Health Act 2001, the same principles of seeking consent apply, and detention under the Mental Health Act does not preclude the need to obtain consent. So, particularly with regard to wards of court, we have more detailed information, but I'm just going to give the headline here. The President of the Ward of Court, very early on in this, wrote to the Chief Medical Officer in the Department of Health, saying that it's her view that vaccination is generally in the best interest of wards. And again, going back to that, she did not expect that everybody would have to apply to the Ward of Court office to ensure vaccination for individuals who are wards. However, if the Ward of the Wards Committee or their guardian ad litem, also known as a GAL, object to the vaccination, the office of the Ward of Court must be notified. And if a ward themselves refuses vaccination, the clinician should do a capacity assessment. Now, by de facto, people who are wards of court are viewed as not having capacity, but in our specific guidance for vaccination, the President is keen that anybody who is a ward would have a specific capacity assessment for COVID-19 vaccination in this instance. If the decision is made not to vaccinate the ward, that decision then must be referred to the Ward of Court office. And early on in this, we did have a case that was referred to the High Court for consideration by the Ward of Court office, where a decision was made not to vaccinate an individual patient, where it was reviewed as being in their best interest not to be vaccinated. And the court supported that decision with a number of medical opinions. So just to summarise, always remember that if a person understands what they're doing, you can't decide for them. So I think the message we're getting across here is that if someone decides against vaccination and you know they have capacity to do so, it may not be or may not seem to you to be the right decision, but you can't decide for them. You have to accept that decision. Capacity is generally assumed for most people. However, for those who have impaired capacity, every reasonable effort should be made to enable a person to make an informed decision about receiving vaccination. The final decision of whether or not to vaccinate an individual lies with the healthcare profession, having assessed decision-making capacity for the specific intervention, that is, for those people who lack capacity, and do not proceed with vaccination if restraint or force are required. And again, my colleague, Professor Okeefe, will talk more about that. And I just want to note to all of you, we've been through an unprecedented year. It's just over a year now since the pandemic was declared and we had our first death in Ireland. I really do believe everybody's worked very hard and worked together to do our best for our patients. Sometimes these decisions are complex or they're not easy. Always ask for help. To this day, I still look for help from my colleagues if I'm concerned about somebody's capacity to consent or indeed of other clinical concerns. So I'd like to take the opportunity actually to thank all of you who are listening, not just for attending today, but the extraordinary amount of work you've done over the last year and are continuing to do. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Siobhan, and thank you for the extraordinary amount of work that you're doing and indeed all the team in the HSE are doing. We're going to turn now to Professor Sean Okeefe. And I just introduced Sean because I think what we're doing with Sean is we're putting up a video in respect of Sean. So he's pre-recorded it, so that just might take a moment or two. So Professor Okeefe is a professor in the National University of Ireland in Galway, and he's also a consultant geriatrician in Galway University Hospital. He is the co-chair of the National Consent Policy Steering Group and is also very heavily involved in drawing up guidance in respect of assisted decision making and also in respect of advanced healthcare directives. He is, I think at this stage, a very well-known figure in these webinars, and it's a great delight to have his video coming up. How are we doing there, Ross? Are we in reasonable shape?
Ready to go, Mary.
Fantastic. So we introduced Sean. We do have the real live Sean here as well, by the way, folks. So he will be joining us for questions, but we thought just because of broadband issues, we'd go for a recording. Thanks, Ross.
Hello, everyone. I want to talk today about the consent process for the COVID-19 vaccine. The principles during vaccination of informed consent and good practice are the same as outlined in the HSE National Consent Policy. There will be some people who need support to make their own decisions and some who are unable to do so even with support. The COVID vaccine's safety profile and effectiveness is in line with previous vaccines. We've had challenges with logistics and communicating through masks and lack of access to supports. We have people who are anti-vaccination and we've vaccine hesitant people. But overall, the potential seriousness of COVID-19 means the balance of benefit over risk is overwhelming for those in high risk groups particularly, and the advice is that while it's up to you to decide whether to get the vaccine, the HSE strongly recommends that you do so as soon as we offer it to you. And this is in the process or in the implementation today of the rollout in acute hospitals. Who can seek consent? Well, it needs to be somebody who's familiar with the important information that they need to convey to the person themselves. It's a health and social care worker. The person doesn't have to be an expert. It doesn't have to be a doctor or nurse, and it doesn't have to be the same person administering the vaccine. We know different hospitals may reasonably take different approaches to implementing vaccination in their institution, and as to who will identify patients, who will take consent and who will actually vaccinate. And in some places there may be the same people, for example, in a specialized vaccination team. And certainly if the person who's seeking consent doesn't know the person well and how best to communicate with them, then it may be helpful to liaise with others who do, particularly if there are any challenges in communication. What is valid and informed consent? Well, the same principles applies for anything else. The person must get sufficient information in a way they can understand about the nature, purpose, benefits and risks of an intervention. They must make a voluntary choice, and they must have capacity to make that particular decision by understanding the relevant information, retaining it long enough to make a choice, and balancing the information in making the decision, and finally, to communicate their decision by whatever means. There is a presumption of capacity which holds unless the contrary is shown, and people don't have to prove to have capacity. And finally, the validity of consent doesn't depend on how information is provided, for example, in leaflet, verbally or other, or in how consent is documented, whether it's electronically or by a note in a chart or a form. When we say making a voluntary choice, well, people must not be put under undue pressure to make a particular choice, and they must know that they have a choice. But this isn't inconsistent with trying to persuade somebody to make a choice, such as accepting vaccination. And healthcare professionals shouldn't be neutral about the value of vaccination, particularly when dealing with high-risk groups. If someone lacks capacity to decide regarding COVID vaccination, what should happen? The first quote is from the statutory instrument, the law introduced by the minister to deal with vaccination. And it states that if the person is unable to give such consent, then the will and preferences of the person are established and administration is for the benefit of the person. And the HSE National Consent Policy notes that no other person, such as a family member, next of kin, friend or carer, and no organisation can give or refuse consent on behalf of an adult person who lacks capacity to consent unless they have specific legal authority to do so. And that the role of those close to the person isn't to make a final decision about an intervention like vaccination, but to provide greater insight into the views and preference of the person. I mentioned specific legal authority to consent for somebody who lacks capacity, but who has that specific legal authority? And in practice, under our current laws, almost nobody does. In wards of court, the President of the High Court has ultimate authority. Enduring power of attorney, the current law doesn't include the possibility of taking healthcare decisions on behalf of someone. And for the COVID vaccination programme, there's no signature box for third-party consent. I mentioned wards of court, and I'm afraid this is a bit daunting, but it is important because we've had specific directions from the President of the High Court as to how the process should operate for wards. And it's worth noting the terminology that wards sometimes have a guardian ad litem, a court-appointed representative or a committee, who's often a family member authorised to make personal care decisions. But again, for healthcare decisions, it is the President of the High Court has the ultimate authority. The number of wards is relatively small in the country, but it's likely by chance that a lot, certainly of larger acute hospitals, may have wards of court present at the time they're eligible for vaccination. And the same is true for acute mental health units often attached to acute hospitals. And the approach to patients in those units should be the same as for other patients in the hospital system. It has been confirmed that there's no general requirement to seek a court order or court consent for administration of the vaccine. Indeed, the President of the High Court wrote to the Minister for Health that she's concerned that wards will get the vaccine on the direction of their clinicians without undue delay. And this suggests an endorsement by the court of where the rights and benefit of a ward who lacks capacity for decide for themselves lies, namely in vaccination. And the essential first step for hospitals is to identify any wards that may be eligible for vaccination as soon as possible. And we urge you to start that at this stage, even if you're not sure exactly when your own institution will start vaccinating. And the reason is that the ward and the committee or guardian should be given as much advance notice of vaccination as possible, and where possible more than 2 days. And a committee or a guardian ad litem may make an application to the court to seek to prevent vaccination, and that application must be made within 7 days of the notification of the decision to vaccinate. So it is important to identify them early. If you're not sure who the committee or guardian is for a ward, then the Office of the Wards of Court is always very helpful and can be contacted. As information is given to the ward about the vaccine, if the ward consents to vaccination, or he or she agrees to vaccination, or if he or she isn't able to express an opinion and doesn't refuse, then vaccination should proceed. And there's no need to notify the court or seek their approval in these circumstances. On the other hand, as noted, the committee or guardian ad litem can make an application to court to seek to prevent vaccination. If after all efforts to inform and persuade them, a ward refuses vaccination, well, then a capacity assessment should be carried out by the treating clinician to see if they understand the consequences of their decision. It's important to note that a lot of people are taken into wardship because of their inability to make a decision or a set of decisions in a particular area, for example, regarding complex financial matters. And that doesn't mean that they lack capacity to be able to consent or indeed refuse consent to in regard to other decisions. If the ward is determined by the treating clinician to have capacity to refuse vaccination, then the vaccine should not be administered. There's no need to notify the ward court except in the specific and almost certainly very rare case where refusal could adversely impact on the person's placement. If, on the other hand, it's concluded that the ward does not have capacity to refuse vaccination, then written notification of the capacity assessment should be sent to the ward and their committee or guardian, and should include a decision whether vaccination will or will not proceed based on the person's best interests. If the best interest decision is to vaccinate the ward, then as already noted, their committee or guardian may make an application to the court to seek to prevent vaccination. But if that doesn't happen in a timely manner, then vaccination should proceed. If a best interest decision is not to vaccinate, and this might happen, for example, if it was felt that vaccination would cause such distress to the person, or to an extent that it might damage relationships with his or her carers, then the Office of the Ward of Court is to be notified of that decision and of the reason for not providing the vaccine. And just a quick summary, and all of this information will be available on the HSE website, as well as a helpful flowchart documenting the process. But a number of things need to be recorded in the person's healthcare record, including the advance notice of vaccination to the ward and committee or guardian, the efforts made to help the ward make his or her own informed decision, details of the decision to vaccinate or not, and the reason the decision was made. And this might include consent or informed refusal by the ward, a capacity assessment if that was required, and consideration of the best interest of the person if that was required. And all written notifications to the ward, the guardian or their committee or the court should be recorded also. So this is going to be a very small group, I should emphasize, and that information was specific to the ward of court. It doesn't apply to other patients who may lack capacity. People often ask, well, what about the next of kin? It's unfortunate that a false belief persists among healthcare staff and the general public that consent should be sought from the next of kin if a person themselves can't consent. It is a myth, and it's unfortunate that it's perpetuated sometimes by HSE documents. But in fact, the next of kin is only somebody who can be contacted in the event of an emergency. It doesn't convey any decision-making authority. And just to remind you of the HSE Consent Policy, no other person, such as a family member or next of kin, can give or refuse consent on behalf of the person unless they have a specific legal authority to do so. And again, there's no signature, there's no box for other parties to sign. It is important, if somebody lacks capacity, that their will and preferences is determined. And the obvious way of doing that is, first of all, to ask the person if they're able to communicate. And if they agree, if they assent to vaccination as an expression of preferences, well, vaccinate. If they refuse, then people who indicate verbally or otherwise that they don't want to be vaccinated shouldn't be vaccinated, is the bottom line. However, it is important, and the reasons for refusal should be explored. Sometimes it just needs additional time or explanation. And because vaccination is for the benefit of the person, then every practical effort should be made to persuade. And that's not to coerce or to force people to accept it, but it is the right thing to do. If a person can't answer for themselves, well, then those close to the person may know what the person would have wanted, as indeed may staff who know the person well. It is important to make clear, though, that you're asking what the views of the person would have been and not their own personal views, which are quite distinct. And it's also important, because of the importance of vaccination for many groups, that simply saying my mother wouldn't have wanted it isn't just taken without probing further as to how do you know that, or why do you think that? And it's helpful to elicit previous preferences regarding vaccination, whether people took vaccines themselves before when they could express their own views, whether indeed they had their own children vaccinated, because these would be very helpful pointers to their overall will and preferences regarding vaccines. Sometimes those close to the person do have their own views, sometimes very strong views, disagreeing with vaccination. And what should happen in those circumstances? Well, the first thing is to explore why people disagree with vaccination and to carefully consider their views. Nobody wants them to be upset, and as said before, they may have a better insight into the likely will and preference of the person. It's sometimes possible to allay concerns, and sometimes involvement of a general practitioner who knows both the patient and those close to them can be very helpful. But ultimately, unless the objections are based on the likely will and preferences of the person, or unless the person him or herself objects, if vaccination is the right choice and for the benefit of the person, then it should proceed, even if those close to the person disagree with it. You may ask why. Well, the person who lacks capacity has the same right to life and to the highest attainable standard of health as anybody else. And we need to recognise those rights in determining what the appropriate course of action is. It's not appropriate not to give a vaccine that's for the benefit of a person, given the magnitude of risk of COVID, especially for high-risk groups. It's not often possible to defer vaccination to allow further discussion, and any deferral may leave the person at high risk for infection and its consequences. And the advice we're given is in accordance with the statutory instrument introduced by the Minister regarding COVID-19 vaccination. I don't want any of that to give you the impression that this is all extremely difficult and complicated. In fact, the issue of capacity and consent becomes very simple when you look at it this way. If somebody has capacity and consents, vaccinate them. If the person doesn't have capacity and agrees or doesn't refuse, again, vaccinate them. If the person has capacity and doesn't consent, don't vaccinate. And if the person doesn't have capacity and refuses vaccination, don't vaccinate. Thank you very much for your attention.
And thank you very much, Sean, for that recording. And I just spotted a question coming in there in the chat. People were wondering what happened in that case. Somebody had missed it, that case that went to the High Court, and we'll come back to Siobhan on that later. But just to confirm that the High Court approved the position taken by the HSE, which was, or actually, Siobhan, do you want to come in on that quickly now?
Yeah, I'm happy to come in on that. So the issue was a resistance to vaccination, and extensive medical assessment supported that in this particular instance, vaccinating this particular person would not have been in their best interests. The legal firm then consulted with ourselves, the consent working group for vaccination, and we reiterated that position and supported it with an additional affidavit to the High Court. So the High Court affirmed the position and said in this instance they felt that the right decision had been made, that the person would not be vaccinated, and just said that obviously if they expressed a wish to have a vaccination at a future date, that would be facilitated.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Siobhan. And so we turn now to Joanne Condon. Joanne is the Southern Regional Manager for the National Advocacy Service for People with Disabilities. And she's going to talk about something she's spoken about before in some of these webinars, which is supporting people to ascertain their will and preference. She's going to talk about that particularly in the context of the acute hospital setting, where, as I think Philip alluded to at the beginning, there may not be the same level of knowledge as you might have, for example, in residential care facilities. So thank you very much, Joanne.
So thanks, Mary, and good afternoon, everybody. So I'm going to take a really practical look at how to ascertain the will and preference of people who lack decision-making capacity in the context of the vaccination programme against COVID-19. And I think it's really important to say at the outset that while we're specifically looking today at the context of COVID-19 vaccinations, the approach really isn't any different from how we would normally approach consent for any essential medical procedures and medications. So the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities is a human rights treaty adopted by the United Nations in 2006. And this exists to protect and reaffirm the human rights of disabled people. And the UNCRPD's supported decision-making model recognises that all people have the right to make decisions and choices about their own lives, irrespective of the nature of their disability and irrespective of how a person communicates. And so an important starting point is to recognise these rights that we each have. The principles of good practice then with regard to administration of the COVID-19 vaccination are the same principles that are outlined for administration of any healthcare and treatment, and they're consistent right across key pieces of legislation and right across a number of key policy documents. For example, the Equal Status Act protects people from discrimination on the grounds of disability. The ADM Act outlines that everyone has the right to be presumed to be able to make decisions unless the contrary is shown, and that the will and preference of the individual must be central to decision making. The Medical Council Guide to Professional Conduct and Ethics emphasises that every person is presumed to have capacity to make decisions about their own healthcare. The guide also places a duty on medical professionals to support a person to the greatest degree possible to make decisions for themselves, and it states that every adult with capacity is entitled to refuse medical treatment or to withdraw consent. The Code for Professional Conduct and Ethics for Registered Nurses and Midwives promotes again the autonomy of the person to the greatest degree possible, stating that consent must never be presumed, and it highlights again the centrality of will and preference to decision making. And finally then, the HSE Consent Policy outlines that consent is a basic rule of common law. It clarifies there's no lawful basis for next of kin decision making without specific legal authority, and it highlights the duty to maximise a person's capacity and clarifies that a refusal of treatment must be respected even when decisions may result in a person's death. Broadly speaking, there are two categories then of scenarios with people that you are going to encounter in relation to the administration of vaccinations. The first is those who, having been given sufficient information and support to make a decision, will either consent or dissent to receiving the vaccine. The second group then are those who are not in a position to articulate their decision and for whom will and preference must be identified to inform a decision. This approach is in keeping with what is outlined in the Assisted Decision Making Act, which is a best interpretation of will and preference. So a few key points that I want to mention on consent are as follows. Consent stems from the right to bodily integrity. Consent respects the person's right to autonomy and self-determination. It is specific to each intervention and is only valid if three essential components are present: that it is free, that it is full, and that it is informed. And the principles of good practice, again to reiterate, hold right across all situations where a person is consenting to healthcare or treatment, not just for the pandemic, as outlined within the HSE Consent Policy. So step one with every person when seeking consent then is to begin from a position of assuming capacity. Presume that the person has capacity to make their own decisions. Take all practical steps to support the person to make the decision unless or until the contrary is shown. I'm not going to get into too much detail on what is involved in the entire process of supported decision making, but I do wish to briefly outline the key steps that should be taken in order to support that such a process is meaningful. Step one, it's important that people with disabilities are supported to access information about COVID-19 vaccination by people they're familiar with where possible, and that there is trust, openness, and good communication. Again, the starting point is always to assume capacity. Step two is to explore, discuss, and define the decision to be made by the person with regard to the vaccine. Step three is to identify their options and present relevant information in an accessible way. This may be through the use of assistive technology, translators, through plain English, through easy-to-read guides, through visual aids, through SLT support, through the use of law or sign language. Consider if any expert input is required. For example, is it necessary to liaise with a GP, with consultants to gain medical history, to consult with others such as family or advocates with the person's consent always, and always again, as Sean said, to inform, but never to decide. Consider what may be influencing, considering step 4, what may be influencing the person's decision. Is there any duress by others? Their past experiences, are they relevant? Have they been given inaccurate information? Are there conflicts of interest with others that are providing information? Do they have a lack of support? Is there an intensity to make a decision? Do they have a fear of needles that may require further exploration? Check across time for consistency where possible, and do not fast-track decisions. Discuss at different times of the day, particularly important for a person who may have dementia, with different people if present at different times if possible. Consider when the person might best make a decision. Are certain times of the day better for them? Support number 5, the person to weigh the pros and cons of each option. For example, if they are leaning towards not giving consent to the vaccine, supported decision-making assists the person to consider the potential consequences of such a decision so that their decision is an informed one. The person may need to experience the options in order to explore them fully through role play, social stories. They may require a desensitization program. This might include practicing exactly what will happen with the person. It is about exploring with the person what they need to best prepare them so that surprises are minimized, anxiety is reduced, and fears are addressed. Finally, step 6 is to support the person to reach their own decision, to communicate it with others. In situations where, after being supported with the appropriate information, discussions, and support, an individual communicates that they do not want to be vaccinated, this decision must be respected. So a few other important points that I wish to emphasize. The language of the statutory instrument that Sean has already referenced is Willem preference, and this places the emphasis on person-centered decision-making. It maximizes the person's involvement as opposed to making decisions for people that do not involve them. Avoid blanket approaches. It is important to consult on an individual basis. Do not make assumptions that what is right for one person is right for all. When considering a person's capacity to consent, remember the information only needs to be retained by them for long enough to make the decision about the vaccine. And I can't overemphasize the importance for proactive planning. If you know that a person is going to need additional time and support to make a decision, don't wait until the day that vaccines are being administered to support the person with decision making, or indeed to find out about a person's will and preference. Begin as early as possible and document. This process needs time to be done meaningfully. Document the rationale for the decision. Document the decision-making process, who contributed to it, what did they say. And it's important to note that the final decision on whether or not to vaccinate an individual who is deemed to lack capacity to consent lies with the healthcare professional, the vaccinator. However, the process of communication with the person in advance of administration is critical to good practice for informed decision-making and informed consent. And again, document all of that process that is undertaken. So moving then to the practicalities of how will and preference can be established where a person is not in a position to articulate it. How can will and preference be established to inform the decision? Well, in the course of our work with people with disabilities at the National Advocacy Service, we're regularly tasked with identifying a person's will and preference under such circumstances. And to do this, we rely on the use of 4 internationally recognised approaches. This involves gathering information from various sources in order to put the person's own wishes at the centre of the decision to be made. These approaches are known as person-centeredness, witness-observer approach, rights-based approach, and ordinary life principles. I'm now going to use this framework to illustrate how to go about establishing a person's will and preference using these approaches as a guide to the process. So beginning with person-centeredness, this is about finding out all we can about the person from various sources, written and verbal. You may need to access files, records, healthcare files that specifies medical information, reactions, allergies. You need to question, does the person fall into the high risk or very high risk categories? Is the person a ward of court? Speak to those who know the person well, only to inform, never to decide. The aim is to build a clear understanding of the person. For some people, having too much advance notice may invoke anxiety, and for others, not knowing when may cause anxiety. So we need to know the person's communication profile and any essential information that others can share. What information can be established about the person from those who know them? Values, beliefs, preferences, and attitudes. Views on previous vaccines, such as the flu vaccine or children's vaccinations. What has been their past behaviour and convictions, their cultural, religious, ethnic, and moral factors. In weighing up the information provided by others, consider, is the information accurate, reliable, and probe further if necessary, documenting what you discover. Consider how long the individual has known the person, what their relationship with the person is like. Secondly, using the witness-observer approach, focusing on what can be learned from observations of the person. What is known about the impact of vaccine administration for this person? Are they fearful? Sometimes there can be a conflict between a person's will and a person's preference. For example, it may be their will to be vaccinated, but their preference may be that a needle is not inserted into their arm. In such situations, it will be important to support a person to work through such conflicts. It's important not to confuse fears, anxieties, phobias, or specific sensory issues as a refusal to be vaccinated, but rather recognize that a support plan may be needed. Is reasonable accommodation required? Would time, numbing gel, or other supports help to alleviate anxieties? Some people may require additional explanations, reassurances, distractions, role plays, or supports in the form of desensitization programs, or indeed specific supports with regard to needle phobias. Pain sensitivity for others will be a consideration to address. Give predictability as best as possible and minimize surprises. Consider what will help the person. On the day of the vaccine, observe the responses of the person. Pushing away, walking away, withdrawing arm. Are they content? Are they distressed? Note these things down. For some people, the reality is, even with all of the supports in place, they will not wish to obtain the vaccine, and that must be respected. Observe body language, facial expressions, vocalizations, and gestures. Try to understand what is being communicated by the person and anything that could better support them. Those who know the person best may be able to accurately interpret this communication. If inadequate preparation has taken place, ask if the vaccine administration could be rescheduled to later that day to allow more support to be offered to the person. Using a rights-based approach. This is about respecting the person's human rights, and there are dual considerations with this. On the one hand, considering the person's right to life and their right to the highest attainable standard of health, and on the other hand, respecting their right to bodily integrity. A really useful and easy framework to adopt a rights-based approach to people is through adherence to what are called the FRIDA principles. These are set out in detail in HICWA's guidance document on supporting people's autonomy, which can be found on their website. And this framework invites us to consider if our actions towards the person are in line with the principles of fairness, respect, equality, dignity, and supporting autonomy. And of course, we've mentioned, as per the HSE Consent Policy, that there is no such thing as next of kin decision-making or assumed authority. Final approach then is ordinary life principles. And ordinarily in the course of advocacy work, this approach would be used to look at a person's quality of life under 8 specific domains. For the purposes of the decision we're looking at, the vaccine administration, the domain of well-being is particularly relevant. Material risks and benefits are important to consider. Irish law always requires a person-centered consultation to learn what is material to a person and their lifestyle. The test of materiality is judged from the perspective of that particular person in those particular circumstances. Their health, their medical history, their risk category, their environment, their seizure risk, past reactions, allergies. All of these material risks and benefits will be different for every person, and hence the importance of an individualized approach. Look at medical considerations. Consider quality of life. How will not receiving the vaccine impact the person's quality of life, for example? How might it impact their social life and community access, their relationship with others, and finally consider the benefits and risks. Is harm minimised to the person and others? Of course, there's overwhelming evidence that there's a much greater risk to their health and well-being from contracting COVID-19 than there is from accepting the vaccination. Hopefully this framework has illustrated how it's possible to establish somebody's will and preference when they're not in a position to articulate it. I've included a number of useful resources and links that you can look at in your own time for further information. I do want to mention and just show you there the contact details for the National Advocacy Service. And it is possible to make an inquiry for an independent advocate for a person in relation to this issue if there are particular difficulties. Equally, I want to share the details of the Patient Advocacy Service. And if a person requires advocacy support to make a complaint in relation to some aspect of their care in relation to this particular matter in a public acute hospital, that service is also available for people to contact. As I come to a close, I just want to finish where I began, which was by reiterating an emphasis on rights. The key take-home message is that we all want consent to be respected and we all want human rights to be respected. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Joanne, and that's very helpful, that reference to those services, which again, people in acute hospitals may feel the need to refer people to them in particular contexts. Our final main speaker today is Dr. Chantel Migoney. She is a public health specialist and works with the National Immunisation Office. We're very pleased to have her here because I think she's going to hopefully update us as to how things have been going in respect of the COVID-19 vaccination programme. So thank you very much, Chantel.
So I'm going to give you a quick overview of the COVID-19 vaccination programme. So we all know that COVID-19 has had such a significant impact on morbidity and mortality, both globally and in Ireland. So in Ireland, we're now over 4,500 deaths and over 227,000 confirmed cases of COVID-19. And we also know that those that bear the highest burden of morbidity and mortality are those people who are older, and also those who have had underlying health conditions, with particularly in the first wave, the residents of long-term care facilities and nursing homes bearing the brunt of the consequences of the pandemic. And we know that morbidity and mortality from COVID-19 are higher in certain groups, as I've mentioned, older people, but also people who have underlying health conditions, which are listed in this slide, and more details regarding these conditions can be found in the guidelines of the National Immunisation Advisory Committee. So what are the aims of our pandemic COVID-19 vaccination programme? Well, first of all, to prevent morbidity and mortality from COVID-19, also to protect our healthcare services, protect essential services, and minimise social and economic disruption. And the pandemic vaccination programme strategy and implementation is underpinned by an ethical framework, and you can see the principles of that ethical framework listed there in the slide. So the National Immunisation Advisory Committee, to guide the pandemic vaccination programme in the context of a limited vaccine supply, which we have at the moment, has developed priority groups for vaccination, and these have also been endorsed by NEFIT. And the vaccination programme has been rolled out to these groups, starting with those who are at highest risk of morbidity and mortality, which was the residents, older residents of long-term care facilities, and people at high risk of exposure, which are frontline healthcare workers, and then older people and people with underlying medical conditions, putting them at high risk. And then as we get more supplies into the country, the vaccine will be rolled out sequentially to other groups, which are listed here. So what vaccines have been authorised for use in Ireland? Well, we have 4 vaccines authorised for use, approved by the European Medicines Agency. 2 are mRNA vaccines, which is the Pfizer vaccine and the Moderna vaccine, and 2 are viral vector vaccines, so the AstraZeneca vaccine, and the most recently authorised vaccine, which is the Johnson & Johnson vaccine. So as you know, the AstraZeneca vaccine, administration of this vaccine has been paused at present, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about that later on. And the Janssen vaccine isn't yet used in Ireland. It has been approved, but not yet used in the programme, so I won't talk about that vaccine too much. It is in use in the US because it has been approved by the FDA there as well. And all the vaccines are licensed from the age of 18 years. The Pfizer vaccine is the only vaccine licensed from the age of 16 years. So I won't go into detail with how the vaccines work just in the interests of time, but just to say that both the mRNA vaccines and the viral vector vaccines are not live vaccines. They don't contain any live virus. And the other thing that's important to note about both vaccines is that they can't in any way interact with a person's own DNA. That's something that sometimes you will hear people asking about and being concerned about, but it's not possible for either of those vaccines to interact with a person's own DNA. So how well do the vaccines work? Well, this is the data that we have from the phase 3 trials of the vaccines, where tens of thousands of people received vaccine, and rates of COVID-19 disease were compared in those who received the vaccine and those who received a placebo or a control. And we know from these phase 3 studies that all the vaccines that we're using in our programme in Ireland have very high efficacy. So you can see there the mRNA vaccines over 90% efficacy, and the AstraZeneca vaccine in more recent data that was published in The Lancet, 82% efficacy when the 2 doses are given with a 12-week interval. But all the vaccines are given as 2 doses. And the Janssen vaccine, which has been approved, is given as 1 dose. Just to note that what's really important is that all 3 vaccines had very, very high efficacy in preventing severe COVID-19 disease and hospitalization. And the same data is now coming out in the real world from COVID-19 immunization programs that have been running in Israel and in the UK, where this has also been shown to be very effective in preventing both cases of COVID-19 and hospitalizations with severe COVID-19. So what about the adverse events that were reported in the trials? So you can see here the commonly reported adverse events: pain at the injection site, fatigue, headache, myalgia, and chills most commonly reported, and fever more common after the AstraZeneca vaccine. The adverse reactions were in the main mild to moderate in intensity and resolved themselves after a few days. Something that you might have heard about is the mRNA vaccines and reports of acute peripheral facial paralysis occurring after administration of the vaccine. So this was seen rarely in people who had received the vaccine, but in fact, when you compared the rates compared to what you would expect anyway in the general population, there was no difference. And this is also the case that has been seen since the vaccines have been used in national programs. There's no difference in the rates of peripheral facial paralysis in those receiving the vaccine to that which you would expect anyway in the general population. One thing in relation to anaphylaxis is that the mRNA vaccines appear to be associated with an increased frequency of anaphylaxis. It's rare, but it is more common, it seems, than with other vaccines that we're used to using. And so for that reason, the National Immunisation Advisory Committee has recommended a longer period of observation of 30 minutes for some people after vaccination if they have particular risk factors. But again, it's rare, and all vaccinators are trained in managing this rare event. So is there anybody who shouldn't receive COVID-19 vaccines? Well, the contraindication to the vaccines is anaphylaxis following a previous dose of the vaccine or any of its constituents. And in terms of precautions, there are some precautions to the use of the vaccine. I won't go into it in detail, but just to say that if somebody has had COVID-19 disease, it's advised to wait at least 4 weeks after diagnosis or onset of symptoms before vaccination. And that's really to avoid confusing symptoms which might be complications of COVID-19 itself with any potential adverse reactions from the vaccine. So just a period of 4 weeks advised. And people who are immunosuppressed can receive COVID-19 vaccines. It's possible that they may not be as effective because their immune response may not be as good. However, it's important that they do receive COVID-19 vaccines because obviously they're at risk of the severe effects of COVID-19 disease. And if somebody has planned immunosuppressive therapy, they should ideally complete vaccination 2 weeks before treatment. But there isn't any recommendations to stop any treatment for people who are already on immunosuppressive therapy before vaccination. So what about pregnancy and breastfeeding and fertility? There's a lot of questions come up, particularly with regard to healthcare workers in relation to this. So there's limited experience of the use in vaccines in pregnant women, but there isn't any evidence that there are direct or indirect harmful effects in pregnancy. And what the National Immunisation Advisory Committee recommends is that where it's decided that the risks and benefit ratio is favourable, then vaccination should take place. So pregnant women who are at high risk of severe disease and healthcare workers who are at high risk of exposure to COVID-19 disease should discuss the risks and benefits with their obstetrician or their GP. And a shared decision should be reached about vaccination. And where it's decided to go ahead with vaccination, then vaccination should be given between 14 and 33 weeks of gestation. COVID-19 vaccines can be given to women who are breastfeeding, and there's no issue with that at all. And there's also no evidence that the vaccine affects fertility in any way. There's no biologically plausible reason why that would be the case. And there's no evidence at all regarding any impact on fertility. Also, there's no need to leave any interval after having COVID-19 vaccine and becoming pregnant. And what's really useful is that the National Immunisation Advisory Committee with the Institute of Obstetricians and Gynecologists have produced some really useful documents, questions and answers for pregnant or breastfeeding women, and including decision aids to help women make decisions about COVID-19 vaccination. So what has been the experience so far in terms of the programme and how it's been doing both in Ireland and globally? Well, there's been more than 300 million doses of COVID-19 vaccines administered globally, including 25 million in the UK and almost 77 million in the USA, who are using the same vaccines that we're using in our programme. And all the reports up until to date have been that the safety profile has been unchanged and the benefits outweigh the risks. Benefits of vaccination outweigh the risks of any adverse events. So then more recently, you'll all have heard about AstraZeneca vaccine and the signal of thromboembolic events. So the National Immunisation Advisory Committee recommended that there would be a pause on the administration of COVID-19 vaccine AstraZeneca on the 14th of this month. And this was because there was a signal, a safety alert from the Norwegian Medicines Agency of 4 reports of some rare thromboembolic events in people who had received the vaccine. And the European Medicines Agency was investigating this and monitoring very closely any adverse events associated with vaccination. So on the back of this, the National Immunisation Advisory Committee advised that there would just be a pause to the programme. There haven't been any events of this kind received by the HPRA to date, despite the fact that 124,000 COVID-19 AstraZeneca doses have been given in Ireland. And just to note also that the UK, which has given more than 11 million doses, haven't noticed any increased incidence in these events compared to the background rate expected in the general population. So we don't know what the relationship with these events is. We know that clotting events are not uncommon and they happen in the general population for many different reasons. So the European Medicines Agency is investigating this. And we're expecting information from them and their report in the next few days, which will give us more information. And we very much hope that we'll be able to restart the vaccination with AstraZeneca, but we'll await information from the EMA and guidance from NIAC. Just to say that this doesn't in any way affect the other vaccines that we have in our programme, the Pfizer and Moderna vaccines. There has been advice issued by the National Immunisation and also the HSE in relation to people who had a dose of AstraZeneca vaccine. So it's really just to be alert if there's anything unusual or they feel unwell, to check with their doctor and consult a doctor, and they don't have to take any additional medication or stop any medication that they're taking at present. And finally, just to say that we have lots of information on our website, and we have guidance and guidelines, and we have weekly bulletins that update vaccinators on any changes to the programme. There's those resources from the RCPI, NIAC, and we also have our HSE Land programme, which has a module on communicating with people who may be uncertain about vaccination, and also obviously all the information materials for the public in various forms, translated, easy read guides, etc., are available on the HSE website. And that's it from me. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Chantel. And that was a really, even for a non-scientific person, a gloriously clear description. So thank you very much for that. And as all of you will see, lots of stuff going in, lots of links going in there to the chat as well, which I think is very helpful if there's anything of any particular interest. We're going to turn now to the panel, and we're very lucky to have a very experienced panel, and that's actually what we're going to be kind of drawing on, really, is their experience. So I begin by introducing the panel. We've Mary Keogh Sullivan, who's the HSE National Quality Improvement Specialist for Disability Services. We've Sarah Lennon, who's the Executive Director of SAGE Advocacy. We've David Robinson, who's a consultant geriatrician in St. James's Hospital, and Siobhan Kennelly, who's a consultant geriatrician in Connolly Hospital. And we're going to ask them, I'm going to actually, we will get to some of the questions in the chat box as well, but we thought it might be useful to ask these people, all of whom have had experience on the ground of delivering vaccinations or the process, or the consent process, what their experience has been, and what they would like to share with any of you who are sort of moving into this process at this point. And we might start, if we may, with David, please. David, if you'd talk us through a little bit the experiences in James's, what's gone well, what hasn't, what lessons can be learned, and thank you.
Hi, thanks very much. I think the biggest issue for us is just supply. That's the biggest issue, it's not around consent at all, because I think there's an assumption that the hospitals are part of the rollout of vaccinations, and we're not. In fact, we get short notice of supply. So for instance, we've been told today that we've got, I think, 80 doses, and we need to come up with names by Thursday to vaccinate people. So we have to identify those people over 70 who haven't been vaccinated, who are well, who have life expectancy of more than 3 months, and consent then is down the list. We have been vaccinating people in their best interests if they're not able to consent, in the same way we would operate on people in their best interests if they're not able to consent. And there have been a couple of issues. The one that Siobhan Rea was involved with was a patient, had been a patient in the unit, somebody who was technically not capable of refusing the vaccine, but did refuse it, and that was consistent with her prior beliefs. And we had one other issue where family were refusing the vaccine on behalf of a patient, which, as Sean would point out, isn't actually relevant, but they were using that as leverage, because there's an assumption amongst families as well that we're going to vaccinate patients. Yeah.
Thanks very much, David, and that's two very important points there, which is, in a sense, respecting a refusal in a context in which the harms would outweigh the benefits, but then also the issue of families. So thank you very much. I might turn to, and we might come back to you for further elaboration later. We might turn now, if we to Sarah Lennon, and Sarah is the executive of SAGE Advocacy. Any lessons, Sarah, that you've learned from your work over the last months?
Yes, thank you very much. I think the lessons would fall into two general categories. One has been around communication, and the other's been around the area of consent, capacity, and next of kin generally. You know, we've had some very good examples of communication where, working with nursing homes in particular, where they broke down what consent meant under the guiding principles for assisted decision making. There was a very good example of a nursing home resident who told a SAGE advocate that he was advised about the vaccine, had any queries answered, and was asked if he was happy, and was given the time to ask the questions that he had. And some other examples of where there was celebration days in nursing homes around the arrival of the vaccine to mark the occasion. Some of the positive experiences have been around consent forms being drawn up and either handed to the family member as their next of kin to fill in, or simply handed to the resident without any consent process around that. And I think there's been two distinct differences on next of kin. One has been family members who have just been routinely given the consent form to sign on behalf of their loved one. But on the other hand then, and this has been less typical, but still have been a few cases where family members who did, or who more usually did not want their family member to be vaccinated, seeking to influence the decision. One of the other specific areas that have come up as well is around the whole area of fluctuating capacity, where somebody may have be very capable today, but less tomorrow. And what a lot of the nursing homes have done is discuss it with the family, but also to practically involve the GP, who may have experience of that as well. So around communication, issues around next of kin, and areas around fluctuating capacity have been the three highlights of the programme so far.
That's brilliant. Thank you very much, Sarah. We might turn to Mary next, from a disability services perspective. Mary, any lessons from what you've seen in the last number of months which you think would be useful to share?
I think preparation is the key, Mary. The thing that we've learned is that this is not something that should be rushed. So there are all of the documents around the various different vaccinations have all been developed into easy reads. And this is very important because it allows a family member, or indeed a staff member, depending on where the person is living, to talk through and to show pictures, and to do it in a way that is understood by many people. I think what Joanne was talking about there is very important as well, that there are desensitization programs available. This is something that's done maybe a week in advance, where you actually practice giving a vaccination to somebody. And those kinds of things are very important, because it might not be the vaccine itself that people are frightened of or unsure about, but it's the actual fact they're like that. They don't like any type of procedure and are nervous about any type of procedure. So it's about making sure that people are comfortable. And I suppose the big lesson there as well is to make sure that familiarity is very important. So a familiar environment, if at all possible, for vaccinating, but key, if you can't have a familiar environment, if the person's in the hospital, for example, having a familiar person with the individual who's being vaccinated is very important.
Thank you very much, Mary. Siobhan Kennelly, again, coming back now, and I'm going to ask Siobhan and Sean, all of whom have direct experience, I guess, in the acute sector. Any lessons from that you'd like to share over experiences over the last number of weeks and months?
Thanks, Mary. I mean, actually, I think in some respects, Mary kind of highlights, I think, what the main challenges are actually going to be in actually delivering this in the acute sector, in that you know, we're very much dealing with an environment where patients are probably not as well known to the clinical teams. You know, you know, I suppose it'll be very important. I suppose those relationships that have worked well in the long-term care setting and the disability sector are more difficult to establish, I think, a lot of the time. So it really will be, I think, around people within those environments having ownership, let's say, within their unit in terms of this particular process, and being able to form that relationship. You know, I think consistency in terms of who's actually doing this is actually really important in terms of the experience that they actually gain, and also their ability then to engage with patients and families and others. Because you know, I suppose realistically we are in a context now that's really kind of very much around, I suppose, some anxiety around the vaccine as well, and we can't ignore that. And certainly, you know, if I was to look at my own team and my own service, who were getting calls this morning, just like David was, around patients being identified, you know, by Thursday. I mean, everything that they're hearing on the news today is just going to kind of cause some kind of level of anxiety. So clearly, I think some consistency in, you know, the person who's actually engaging with those people and who's actually going through the process, you know, with patients and families alike, I think will be actually really critical. And I do think, you know, that's going to need more experienced people. Unfortunately, the routine in a lot of situations is that it might be, you know, somebody who's relatively new in the team. It might be an intern or an SHO, or, you know, somebody who isn't maybe necessarily that familiar with how some of this is. And I think in some situations that's going to require a more kind of experienced, nuanced person. We've been very, very lucky, I think, in the long-term care sector that Many of the directors of nursing very ably took this on. They have very good expertise, I think, in dealing with the patients and with their families in terms of the experience that they have. And hopefully, equivalent, I think, roles within the acute hospital setting who can manage the process will be really, I think, important. I think the other kind of practicalities are really just down to some of the communications on the operational side. I mean, a big part of this will be that there will be some, at least within the cohorts that we identify, who may already have had the first dose. Is this a second dose vaccine, and is this a process that they've already gone through somewhere else in terms of consent or elsewhere? So just those kinds of, I think, issues are probably going to bubble up as things kind of roll out a bit, and we're expecting to hear, that some of this is actually kind of happening, and both operationally and I think from a consent point of view. So I think I think this session has been really useful in terms of informing what the consent end of it, but a lot of it actually comes down to how both ends are actually operating in terms of the rollout and the consent.
Thanks a million, Siobhan. That's really important in terms of recognising both what's happening in the wider world at the moment and then also operational issues. Siobhan Rea, would you like to sort of add anything there? And then I also have a question for you from the chat, if I may.
I don't think I have anything to add. I think my colleagues have covered it very well. So we're happy to take any questions, yeah?
Yes, by the way, folks, I'm thinking we might stay until about 2:20 just because there's a couple of questions, and I'd also like to bring the real life Sean Okeefe in as well. So, Siobhan, the question I wanted to ask from the chat is, can a long-term care facility refuse to take an admission from an acute hospital if the client has declined vaccination? I'll ask you and maybe Sean if he wants to come in on that as well.
That is a difficult question, Mary, to be quite honest with you.
It is, isn't it?
I can't answer it directly. I think we would not recommend that, but the concerns of the long-term care facility would have to be addressed. I don't think there's a yes or no answer to it, to be honest.
Yeah.
Can I come in there, Mary?
Yeah.
There is a difference if they're de novo referrals, you're trying to admit somebody for the first time to a long-term care facility, or if they've lived there before. I think it's more likely to occur in the first situation, and we can't boss private facilities and tell them what to do anyway. But not taking back one of their own residents because they refused vaccine, again, we can't make it happen, but it is something that HICWA in the past has looked poorly on occurring without very good reason. And I think the argument would be if most people in the facility are vaccinated, then the risk to that single individual and anybody else is very low. So I think it would be unreasonable for them to do it, even if we can't make them change.
Fantastic, thanks, Sean. And I think I've gotten most of the questions, but Sean, have you anything you'd like to add, again, from your experience on the ground in terms of working within an acute care setting?
I think it's been mentioned already by Sarah and others. It's an opportunity to deal with this issue that's bugged us for an awful long time of next of kin and consent forms. And it's one we dealt with in the consent policy and will in the consent policy revision. And maybe this gives a chance to cut through, again, that there is never any rationale for getting third parties to sign consent forms, and never has been. And the problem of next of kin has actually led to problems over the years with trying to track down distant relatives and dragging people in the night to sign forms. And it was never correct. And maybe the webinar and our efforts in this case, where the consent will be recorded electronically for many people, there won't be anything for them to sign, and nor should there necessarily be if the electronic consent process is working correctly.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Sean. Chantel, have you anything you'd like to add, again, from your experience over the weeks and months that have happened? And I guess Siobhan Kennelly identified questions which are arising now in the community because of the news, etc. Have you anything you'd think was important to share?
I think there's various things that that people it comes in cycles a little bit that people might be worried about. There's a huge amount of information there, and what we always say is talk to your trusted healthcare professionals. So whether that's if it's in a long-term care facility, the staff that are looking after you or whatever, for individuals, I think that's hugely important. And that's been shown actually to be one of the most important things. People are undecided, that the conversation with somebody that they trust can really make the difference in whether people accept a vaccine or not.
So the significance of pointing people towards clear information and accurate information, I think. And as you say, there are cycles in these kinds of things. And then finally, Joanne, we might turn to you. Any lessons from your work with National Advocacy Service that you'd like to share? I mean, you've been very helpful earlier, but any grounded experiences you'd like to share?
Yeah, I think, Mary, it's important to mention as well that assumptions shouldn't be made. Assumptions shouldn't be made about the person's disability, first of all, that purely because they have a disability that they would be unable to consent, and also that there wouldn't be assumptions made that it's okay to contact family members and friends without first checking. We would have experience where people are very, very clear on their wishes, that they do not wish for particular family members to be contacted, and that must be respected equally. So no assumptions in any regard, I think, is an important one to reiterate. Again, the next of kin piece, not to be a broken record, but certainly that would be the one that the National Advocacy Service has had a lot of contact on over recent weeks from family members who, wrongly believe that they have a right to make decisions on behalf of other people. And I think it's important to, I suppose, support those people to the right places, to access reliable information, to point them to the HSE Consent Policy, to these webinars, and to be able to ground what we're saying in policy and legislation, And I think that's why, I suppose, in the presentation, I moved further outside of the consent policy, because as we saw right across legislation, the message is the same. It's not different. And I think there has been a little bit of misunderstanding as well, that some of our approach to consent and capacity is specifically about the COVID-19 vaccine. It's not. The same principles, the same good practice applies right across the healthcare and treatment decision-making area. So that's important. I'll finish on a positive note. We have seen some really good practice across disability services and nursing homes. Proactive planning, the use of lots of really creative ways of supporting people who communicate in all different ways to understand in advance about the vaccination programme and to be supported to weigh those pros and cons and make decisions of their own accord. So, it's not all bad news.
Thank you very much. And yes, we've seen an awful lot of really good practice through these webinar series, and thank you very much for being part of it. We'll finish there, everybody. I'd like to thank our speakers and our panelists. It's been a great pleasure to have you, and I think you've provided both practical and grounded expertise, but also some of the reasons why these things matter. And as I think you've said, Joanne and others have said, this is about the human rights of the individual and recognising and respecting the individual. So thank you all very much for your time. Thank you to those of you who've been listening to us. This will be available on the Assisted Decision Making website from hopefully later this week. And so for now, until we meet you again at another webinar, thank you for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you again, and have a good day and a good St. Patrick's Day tomorrow. Bye-bye.